Hello, everyone, and welcome to this webinar on the coronavirus crisis, the implication for an evolving cybersecurity landscape. My name is Joyce Hakme. I'm a senior researcher with the International Security Program at Chatham House and the co-editor of the Journal of Cyber Policy. It is becoming increasingly clear that the outbreak is not just a serious health issue, but also a cybersecurity risk. Recently, the World Health Organization, the US Department of Health and Human Services, hospitals in Spain, France, and the Czech Republic have all been victims of cyber attacks. In the Czech Republic, the cyber attack targeted a hospital which hosts one of the country's biggest COVID-19 testing laboratories, forcing it to shut down its entire IT network, reschedule urgent operations, and redirect patients to nearby hospitals. Health sector organizations are not the only target of cyber attacks in this outbreak. The ongoing pandemic has presented an opportunity to criminals who have swiftly took advantage of the situation and adapted their techniques to exploit our fears around the COVID-19 pandemic. According to Europol, the European law enforcement agency, pandemic profiteering is on the rise. Fraud operations, scams, online child abuse, counterfeit goods, and selling discounted scam material on the dark web, referred to as corona goods, have witnessed a big surge, and the expectation is that these crimes will continue to grow. The outbreak has also spurred an infodemic with a myriad of fake news and misinformation available online, posing a big risk to the global health response. Today's webinar will discuss how the current crisis has changed really, or has impacted the cybersecurity landscape. What are possible solutions that the governments, private sector, international organizations can actually implement, and what are the remaining challenges? I'm very pleased to have with me today on the panel three excellent speakers who will talk about this from their perspectives. Have Neil Walsh, the Chief of the Cybercrime and Anti-Money Laundering Department at the UN Office of Drugs and Crime, Lisa Quest, the Head of Public Sector of the UK and Ireland at Oliver Wyman, and Dan Jeffrey, the Head of Innovation, Delivery and Business Operations at the NHS Digital, who's also Deputy Senior Information Risk Owner. So the way we're going to do this is we will give the speakers or our three panelists a few minutes to give us their opening remarks about what is it that they have seen in the last 2 months from their own perspective. How did the landscape has been changed from the NHS, from the UN, and from the private sector perspective. We'll then ask them a couple of questions and we'll turn to your questions. So please do take note of all the burning questions that you might have. We will have time to address those. So I'd like to start maybe with Neil. Neil, if you can just walk us through what you have been seeing from the UN perspective, that, given that you work with a lot of governments around the world, what are the biggest trends that have emerged in the last 2 months?
Thanks, Joyce, and good afternoon, everybody from Vienna. I think what we've seen evolve over the past 4, 6, 8 weeks has really shown the scale and the speed at which criminals can respond, and probably the way that governments and even private sector will struggle to keep up with how the criminal landscape evolves. We've seen a real evolution and growth in the things that we could predict. So online fraud, the selling of non-existent drugs, alcohol, hand sanitizers. We've seen only in the past couple of days, we've seen the cures, the alleged cures for COVID-19 being on sale. We've seen some governments, unfortunately, buying into that fraud and selling that and sending these non-proven cures and elixirs to other countries, which probably isn't massively helpful. We need to focus on the science and let the science lead our responses. We've seen a real increase in dark web-based activity. So for those who are unfamiliar with that, the encrypted part of the internet, where you need to download a browser, a special browser, and get onto sites where it is unclear who hosts them and moderates them. We've seen criminals on dark websites who are clearly not experienced cyber criminals trying to work out where they can make money from the pandemic. So they've been asking each other, okay, where's the best intervention for me? Where do I make money? That's been selling or claiming to be able to sell antiviral masks, everything you need, public PPE equipment, right the way through to medication that doesn't exist. And like so much of this, it is based on a false premise. It's a fraud. There is no real material behind it. And then we've seen bizarrely, and I was going to say welcome, but I'm not convinced that's the right word, but we've seen some criminals telling others not to try and exploit the pandemic. We've seen some who were looking at sending ransomware, so encrypting software, towards hospitals, towards antiviral development labs, vaccine development labs. Some criminals saying, hey, that is not cool, do not do that. But from what we've seen around the world, we have seen that happening, and that risk will always exist. We've seen that for a long time. What we do see growing at real scale, and this is probably the most worrying part for us, is online child sexual abuse and exploitation. And yesterday I was on a call with Her Majesty Queen Sylvia of Sweden and Catherine de Bolle, the Executive Director of Europol, and we were discussing the scale of this. And one of our private sector partners who does a lot of dark web work, including presence on dark web forums that you need to register for, has seen the growth of child abuse material anywhere between 200% and 300% over the past few weeks in terms of the numbers of forums that are available and the number of hyperlinks that are posting child abuse material. We've seen a growth in the number of children being offended against, probably by parents, caregivers, or others who they live with. We see the crime growing, and we see the capability of policing to respond is very, very difficult.
Right. Well, thank you very much for this. Before I turn to Lisa, maybe like just a kind of a question to you on what you just said. You know, when it comes to cybersecurity and preparedness, a lot of governments, and for evident reasons, of course, focus on and plan for an attack against the critical national infrastructure, whether the health, the transport sector, finance, etc. What do you think the lessons that this crisis will teach governments on how to prepare for crimes targeting individuals? And what can they do to prepare better should there be another wave of the disease or in the event of any other similar crisis in the future?
It's a great question, Joyce, or multiple questions. I think what we see in this is anyone who was unsure what critical national infrastructure is, well, now you know what it is. It's the people who kept working. It's the people who kept the internet working, who kept our telephones working. And everything else about that, if we're sitting working at home, as much as I would love to think I'm part of the critical national infrastructure, I'm really not. I'm sitting in my daughter's bedroom. So we now understand in really clear terms what our critical national infrastructure is. And I think we also get a sense from that where the cyber risk and the cyber elements sit into that and can come into that. And I think this is the web call for government, and the message that we give really clearly to government is this is not the time to de-invest in cybersecurity or countering cybercrime or the capacity of your law enforcement and intelligence agencies to counter cybercrime. You need to continue to invest in that, because we have no doubt that malicious state-based actors, that cyber criminals, are looking for every opportunity they can right now to try and take action, to try and either get to a place that allows them to commit the work that they wish to, or to look at other opportunities in the future to infiltrate, to target, to make money. And when we bring that to an individual level, it's why having discussions like this is so important. Sometimes I think the language of cyber is really off-putting to some people, so we need to put the cyber bit to one side and say, this is just another element of how day-to-day life works. What do we all do to protect ourselves? What impact can we have to secure our own devices, our own companies, our own governments, our own business? And with that, we can start to scale things up in a way that is beyond the role, I think, of government on their own to try and do.
Thank you very much, Neil, and I'm sure I'll come back to you with more questions. Turning to Lisa, can you share with us your views on, how the landscape has been changing from a private sector perspective?
Sure, thank you, Joyce, and thank you everyone for joining. I echo Neil's views in terms of the impacts that cyber is having, but I would add another major dimension to that, in that there is a huge disruption in people's economic lives at the moment, and cyber criminals are using that massive disruption for both individuals and businesses to exploit personal financial circumstances and create cyber attacks that are targeted at using that disruption and confusion to transfer money from individuals to them, from businesses to them, from government to them. And we're seeing that in a number of arenas in the economic crime space. The first is around retail phishing. So cyber criminals are using retail phishing out to consumers via text, via WhatsApp, via messaging to say, we are your financial institution, we would like you to send your banking details as a result of this corona interruption scheme where the government is providing, you know, for example, your furlough payment, and therefore you need to send us your information. They're using real information that they're taking from the news and creating credible messaging to individuals to then have them provide their personal banking details back over. And so it's that combination of information that individuals are hearing in the news that adds credibility to these phishing attacks in a way that maybe previously people wouldn't have been as susceptible to it, but they're scared, they've got the coronavirus kind of threat in the back of their mind. It seems like and feels like it's a message that's coming from their government, and they're using very official language and headings often on the papers that they're sending. And so individuals are then responding back, and all of a sudden you've given over your banking information to a cyber criminal. Similarly, we're seeing cyber criminals creating fake companies in order to attempt to access government schemes. So governments are providing around the world business interruption loans to individual companies. SMEs in particular are being faked and then going into the financial institutions and saying, I'm an SME, here's my history of profitability, and therefore I should be eligible for this type of a loan. We're seeing a lot of attempts and cyber attacks in this space, and trying to convince the financial institutions as well to be distributing funds via these schemes. These types of activities really are, in terms of predicate offenses, raising a lot of money. That then money is also being laundered using the disruptions to the systems, because all of our money laundering systems, using transaction monitoring as an example, we often are looking backward in terms of historic patterns and identifying anomalies based on historic financial patterns. Now we're in a disruptive period, and therefore those historic patterns are no longer as accurate as they were previously. And we're seeing really sophisticated cyber criminals taking advantage of this time to launder additional funds through the system, and an uptick in activity there. They're also using the disruption of the fact that all of the financial services employees, for the most part, are now working from home. So we have a disrupted workforce that is less capable of overseeing the activities, and they're taking that disruption in the market, in people's day-to-day lives, in the oversight activities of the individuals who would typically be on the lookout for them, and using that really quick in a sophisticated and quick way to their advantage to push money through the system at this time. I think that brings me on to another area where we focus quite a lot, which is around the development and the effectiveness of public-private partnerships in cyber and in economic crime. And this is something that's incredibly important in terms of bringing together the amazing intelligence that we have distributed across various private sector entities and across various public sector entities, and creating much more effective real-time communication on cyber criminal profiles, typologies, risks, but also real-time data information sharing, and creating the ability to communicate both within a country, across the public and the private landscape, but also increasingly across countries through the international landscape, and effectively using some of the supranational organizations to share the activities that are being undertaken in different countries, so that we can react and try to be as agile as the criminal organizations that we are dealing with that are undertaking these attacks. And so I think the overwhelming thing that we are seeing in both the public and the private sector is just this use of disruption at the moment to create uncertainty, combined and coupled with the fear and the need to move quite quickly, and then the new activities and the economic transfers that are being made between governments and the individuals to disrupt the system. And cyber criminals are doing that to quite good effect, and I think governments and the private sector are looking to combat that. But it is a dance back and forth.
Thank you very much. And Lisa, you mentioned how this public-private partnership is actually working, particularly on information sharing, either within the country or across countries. What do you think are the areas that that the private sector could still work on, and how do you upgrade this partnership to actually start playing like a kind of a bigger role in fighting this problem?
Absolutely. I mean, I think there's much more that could be done in terms of information sharing. The technology that we have today is so much more sophisticated than we had even 2 or 3 years ago, and particularly with respect to privacy enhancing technologies that are available to share individual name level information between private and private sector entities, but also between public and private. I think there are legislative challenges that are still in place that I think we can use this as a catalyst to start addressing those within the kind of confines of personal information sharing and freedom of privacy and data privacy protection rights. But this could also be a catalyst for how we should start thinking about the future of information sharing between those to make them much more effective and to make them real time. Because there is a lot of information that is currently sitting siloed in different organizations.
Right.
And if we were able to unleash that, we would have a much richer data set under which we could actually go after and find and attack back.
Right. One of the problems of creating cyber resilience in a lot of countries is the lack of knowledge and understanding at the level of decision makers, and not necessarily in developing countries. We see it like in different places as well. Do you see that as an obstacle to engaging the government actors in an informed way into these efforts? Do you see a reluctance to engage, or do you think that there is enough understanding on what the issues at stake are and how to go about addressing those?
I think there's been a huge upgrade in public policy decision makers, particularly senior decision making understanding of this. The threat assessments that have been done, the technical working groups that have been established in public-private partnerships have been quite strong in terms of their ability to translate the more technical components of the issues that we are seeing into policy. Right. I think there's a long way to go still, and I think that senior policy decision makers need to kind of engage with the more technical aspects of cybersecurity and resilience to understand what the issues actually are and to fund appropriately the infrastructure changes that are required. But as I was saying, the technology is advancing so quickly that it is different now than it has been previously. We have the ability to share information. We have the ability to engage more effectively. And so I think it's now the time to invest in, I think, using COVID as a catalyst for change in a lot of respects, particularly with respect to the public-private information sharing, would be one area where I would really encourage policymakers to go further and to engage in that.
So this crisis could actually, act as an opportunity to do these sort of like partnership in a more efficient way. And I can see Neil is sharing some documents that UNODC has published on money laundering and cybercrime. I'm sure you'll have a chance to talk about this a little bit more. Moving on to Dan. Dan, obviously, there's no more important organization in the UK at the moment than the NHS, who's doing a heroic job in trying to contain the disease and also treat the people who are getting infected. Can you tell us a little bit more about how, from a cybersecurity perspective, what is it that you have noticed in the last 2 months? What has changed from when the NHS was actually targeted by a ransomware attack back in 2017? What is it that you're working on at the moment? And what do you think are the biggest challenges that are remaining?
Okay, thanks, Joyce. So thank you for the kind words about the NHS and our kind of role at the moment during this crisis. So just to unpack kind of your questions, I think the first things first is, so 2017, the W word, because we're sick of saying WannaCry across cyberspace within the NHS. Just to note, so the NHS was not targeted. We were caught up in an opportunistic attack when it came to WannaCry. It targeted many, or kind of affected many other organizations globally, including telcos, etc. What it did prove, though, was that the system was kind of had a lot of legacy debt to it, based on a lack of understanding of what cyber actually meant. At that point in time, the perceived reality was that cybersecurity was merely an IT problem. It was for the folks down the corridor in the server rooms to fix. What WannaCry really demonstrated to us was that actually cybersecurity, cyber threat, cyber risk is a business problem. When you have kind of 81 organizations out of 220 or 37 at the time affected by a single event, that is a business problem. 19,000 patient interruptions, etc. So off the back of WannaCry, a program which I was brought in to kind of deliver was established, which kind of fell into 3 core limbs. The first limb was to augment, increase, and improve the national capability, so the National SOC, Security Operations Centre. This was to basically provide threat intelligence services and eyes across the estate. Because one of the things with WannaCry is we could not see what was going on at the local level. So that's that first limb. Second limb was we can have the world's best SOC and we can invest hundreds of millions and billions of pounds in it. But if our customer base, i.e. the local organisations themselves, your trusts, your GPs, etc., if they fall over in a stiff breeze, the realisation and benefit of that investment is just never going to happen. So there's a limb of the programme dedicated to improving the security resilience and the security posture of local organisations. And the third bit was outdated legacy operating systems. At the time of WannaCry, I think about 14% of the estate was still on XP. That is now down to less than 1%. That less than 1% is because that XP resides on capital bits of equipment, such as MRI scanners, multi-million-pound pieces of equipment. It's hard-coded in. If you try and mess with it, it loses its clinical accreditation. So then you end up into a position of business benefit, security risk. There's different controls we can put in place. So 3 core limbs. We've been, so that program kind of started in earnest in April 2018. Since April 2018 to today, if we have matured the SOC by over 70%. So we are now trending, for the nerds of us on the phone call, we are at 3.7 out of 5 on the Carnegie Mellon Cyber Maturity Scale. So we're heading towards optimization, but we're very much in that managed space at the moment because we haven't had the time to embed. If we look at the local side, we have moved from a baseline maturity against CE+, which is the standard that NHS England put across the system, that every secondary care organisation, that's basically a trust, was to achieve accreditation to CE+ by June 2021. We moved from the point of Parliamentary Accounts Committee in February 18 to today. We've moved from a baseline of 19% average compliance to 74% average compliance in the space of about 18 months. And then if we look at the outdated operating systems, etc., and the eyes on, I think it was very well publicised that we bought 1 million Windows 10 licenses and 1 million ATP, Advanced Threat Protection licenses, which sit on the endpoint. So we have rolled out over 800,000 of the Windows 10. And for ATP, we've rolled out the entirety, the 1 million, to the point where we've now extended to 1.376 million. And we've currently, as of today, got 1.284 million devices on ATP. So what that gives us, and what that's enabled us to do, is we've matured the SOC, so it's able to respond at pace, it's able to respond at scale, it's leveraged security orchestration and automation response capabilities, so we can do more with the same amount or slightly increased amount of bodies on the ground. And the folks on the ground and in the SOC are able to really concentrate on the difficult stuff, not just triaging basic tickets, etc. So we're able to do more with less. At the local level, the increased resilience means that we have a much more intelligent workforce who are able to deal with a lot more at their own level, but also escalate to the national SOC appropriately and ask the right questions, because a lot of the old school way of doing things was actually trying to understand the problem. They are now much more able, and because of ATP, we're able to understand what's going on at the endpoint itself. So all of that's well and good. COVID, talking about preparing for the unpreparable, was a very good exercise in that precisely, and actually tested our overall strategy, which was not to be caught on the hop again. So we have seen, completely understand and echo Neil, what he was saying about the increase in the types of threat actors, the types of TTPs, techniques, technology and processes that they're undertaking to try and exploit this situation. Increased amount of phishing. They're effectively using the same methodology as we've seen with HMRC at the end of every tax year, but just deploying that for COVID. We've seen propagation or attempt propagations of ransomware attacks. Now, because we've become smarter, slicker at how we do things, every month we're blocking about between, on a good month, 500 million, and on a bad month, 1.2 billion malicious or suspectedly malicious emails from entering the NHS. During the COVID kind of time, it's only been kind of 6 weeks as it were, we have seen kind of similar amounts. So what that tells us is actually that these threat actors, these organised criminals who use phishing as a way to kind of gain their advantage, have actually just changed tact. It's not necessarily more people are getting involved, they're just changing the way in which they're angling for kind of the bait, as it were. And then the other piece is around instant response. So some organizations have run into difficulty. We're dealing with a kind of a organization that has 221 trusts, and then we have 8,400 GPs, 11,600 pharmacies, and then about 25,000 social care organizations. The sheer number would necessitate that something's going to happen somewhere. We have seen that happen, and we have a augmented cyber instant response capability now, with over 1,000 hours under retained contract with a burst capacity on top of that. So that has all held true. Specifically for COVID, we have also spun up a dedicated program in partnership with NHSX and the National Cybersecurity Centre, where we are providing dedicated on-the-ground technical remediation and support for organisations who have said, yeah, we've got a vulnerability or we've got a weakness here. We haven't got the time or the staff to be able to go and sort it out. Can you do it for us? So we spun this up. So the idea was 6 weeks ago. As of today, we've engaged with 111 out of the 221 organizations, of which we have 60 pieces of work going to actually do things from pen testing through to actual kind of building of new backups, and then onboarding into some of our critical services such as secure boundary, all happening with another 40 pieces of work in the kind of scoping phase. So the system is responding. An area of interest though that has emerged is with regards to social media. We have thousands of individuals going back to work or joining Nightingale organizations, and they're really quite rightly proud of doing that. It's a very kind of noble effort and a noble thing to do. Unfortunately, sometimes we've seen a number of instances where on Instagram or Twitter, they've publicized this with their ID badge saying, hi, I'm working here. So as a fraudster, as a organized criminal, I'm all over that. I'm going to use that, I'm going to exploit that, I'm going to start spinning up a phishing campaign, you know, all those kind of good things. So we've now had to kind of reinforce the comms and messaging, both at the social media level, as well as at the clinical level. Because the one thing that clinicians have, or don't have, is time. They're highly motivated, unbelievably intelligent, but horribly time poor. So we have been basically ensuring that the comms campaign and making sure cyber awareness and cyber secure and cyber safe campaigns are all tied in with ensuring patient outcomes. It's not a case of another part of the business has decided, oh, thou shalt not do this. This is about saying, by doing this, you basically ensure the successful delivery of a clinical outcome. And that has, we have the downtrend in the amount of social media posts with ID badges, etc., has been meaningful and significant. The amount of passwords being shared from NHS into, say, more personal and kind of accounts, etc., has dropped off a cliff. The amount of weak passwords we're stopping used to be about 100,000 a month. They've now dropped to about 70,000, which is a meaningful amount. So COVID has introduced additional stresses and strains, but the underlying structures, both from a technical, from a consulting, as it were, kind of advice and guidance perspective, and also from a commercial perspective, have all kind of stayed strong and haven't fallen over with the additional pressures. But that's because we're able to burst. We're able to lean on organizations such as the NCSC, as well as our trusted supplier and partner communities, to be able to provide the boots on the ground, provide burst capacities into the SOC, et cetera, to help us kind of with this really quite unprecedented environment. But it will be a point in time. This is the pace and increase of what we're seeing will not be in perpetuity. it will ramp down. A new normal will be had, but the requirement for continuous burst capacity will diminish over time.
Thank you very much. I'd like to remind our audience that they can use the Q&A function to ask their questions. And just Dan, as a sort of like an immediate follow-up to what you said, I mean, it looks obviously that, you know, the WannaCry was a big lesson to the NHS, and it helped it sort of like ramp up its capacity and rethink the approach to cybersecurity. But as we all know, security is a journey rather than, you know, a destination. We should keep working on upgrading capacity, because vulnerabilities emerge, and there will be always, you know, threat vectors that need to be addressed. Do you think that the current crisis will change your priorities in terms of how you address cybersecurity? And if so, how? And maybe another question, what do you think, because you talked about how you rely on organizations like the NCSC, etc., to help you in this process. What are the remaining challenges? What would you like to see as a cybersecurity person working on the NHS change?
Mm-hmm. Okay, so on the changing priorities, I think what they've done in terms, so you're absolutely right, security is a journey, not a destination. And as part of that journey, you know, we still have over a year of the program to run, and there are projects, programs and capabilities yet to be delivered, but which ultimately something like which COVID has set, basically compelled us to move to the left quite significantly. So an example of that is securing the remote home worker. So previously there may have been 10,000 remote workers across the NHS, something along those lines. We're now looking at a few 100,000. So how do you secure those whilst also giving them the access they need in order to be able to do their job from home? So that could be anything from kind of administrative staff all the way through to imaging, so radiologists, etc., where they're kind of transmitting 0.5 gigabyte images at any one time to be able to do diagnostics from in the comfort of their armchairs rather than in the kind of confines of a hospital. So being able to move what was already in plan to do things like that, because the long-term plan and the tech vision for the NHS necessitates more community-based remote working, right. Opening up APIs, opening up kind of cloud first, internet first. We've moved the capability to the left by 14 months. So something that was planned 14 months ago, within 2 weeks, we'd spun up and we have, I think, about 8,000 users as a proof of concept, kind of going through the remote access kind of capability from our secure boundaries. So if we look kind of beyond COVID, what's it going to be telling us? What priorities does it change? Well, it means that more focus, more attention, more time, treasure and resource needs to be dedicated to primary care and to social care from a security perspective. The overwhelming kind of focus from post-WannaCry was secondary care, major trauma centres, ambulance trusts, acutes, and that is absolutely acceptable, because ultimately when you have a kind of a massive wake-up call like that, with a limited budget, effectively, and a limited amount of time, you have to focus somewhere. It was decided that we focus on those NHS organisations. What COVID has demonstrated to us is there is an absolute need to now pivot and provide more focus, and that's a primary focus, not just a secondary one, on those other areas to make sure we don't have a poor relation from a security perspective across the estate.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you. That was very comprehensive. I'd like to ask you a question on the contact tracing app, and also we have a question on that in the Q&A. So the Parliament's Committee on Human Rights said today that it's not assured that the NHS app protects privacy, and if it doesn't prove effective, the level of data gathered may actually break the law. Mm-hmm. And at the same time, we've heard that the self-reporting aspect of the app is bringing security challenges in a way where people can, or malicious actors can send false alerts. But we've heard the National Cybersecurity Centre saying that removing self-reporting from the app would make managing the disease difficult in the UK, although it's thought that the UK is the only country actually doing this sort of like, or relying on the self-report rather than using the COVID-19 test results, which are normally confirmed by officials. So what is your take on this? And do you think the NHS and NCSC will be able to work together to come up with a solution soon that will help fight this disease, while at the same time protecting privacy and security of UK people? And if so, when?
Okay, so just to be clear, so the contact tracing app is not NHS Digital. This is NHS product. It's not the NHS app, which is what NHS Digital owns, runs, develops, etc. So we don't have much on that at the moment because it is still in the private beta stage. So it's still in development. NHS are owning that development. They're owning the suppliers, the design, etc., etc. And they have brought in the NCSC to provide some initial security assurance, etc. It's been publicly kind of in press, and Dominic Raab and all those kind of good stuff have been speaking about. From an NHS Digital perspective, because it's not going into public beta, i.e. being made literally publicly available, we haven't been engaged on it yet as per the standard process. So we don't really have an answer on that, I'm afraid, at the moment, as it's not within our purview as of yet.
Right. Okay. So as a cybersecurity person from the NHS, you'd want to wait for it to be in the public domain, although we know it's actually already being implemented now in the Isle of Wight.
As a private beta.
As a private beta, okay. But do you think that we will be able, or is it possible actually to, because like one of the things that we normally see in technology is that you have the system or the platform or the app, and then the security concerns are addressed later. The priority is to introduce the platform and think about the security, and it's a mentality of like, the startups, etc. Yeah, I mean, do you think that this is the case, or can the NHS approach this differently?
So I genuinely say, yes, you're right. With application development for any of the applications and services that NHS Digital owns and delivers end to end, we have a DevSecOps lifecycle. So security is built in from design all the way through, and a lot of automated kind of scannings and stuff at each point of the development lifecycle. I can't speak on behalf of NHSX and how they deliver their apps and services. They are a highly competent organisation, and they have the support and the reports from the NCSC, and they've been working with them. So I can assume that they've undertaken that. I can't say with any definitive 100% kind of clarity though, but as I say, they're a highly competent organisation. I would have assumed that they will be, but I'm just not in a position to be able to say whether or not they have, as it hasn't come over our desk yet.
Right, thank you. Actually, there's another question, not necessarily on the NHS, and to all panelists, whoever would like to answer this. They're asking actually a question around what is the problem about using technology with Bluetooth or GPS in it, and what is the objection to the Google and /Apple technological measures for tracing? Who would like to take that question?
So if we talk about the geolocation stuff, so I think implications are it's got to be GDPR compliant, right? So ultimately, you need to be able to turn on, turn off the geolocation elements of things in order to be compliant. You have to consent into it. To have it as a default, that's fine. You can opt out, but in principle, the concern would be is that you can basically get an idea of what people's movements are, I would assume, from geolocation. It's kind of in the name. And some people, it's well within their rights, are uncomfortable with that. There should be I believe there would be a option to turn that off. Otherwise, it wouldn't necessarily be compliant with everything as far as I can tell. On the Bluetooth side, I think it's more about the stress and the drain that it has on your battery, because it's quite an intensive, quite a power intensive kind of capability. And then there's also technical kind of challenges around whether or not it works in the background when you've got your phone locked and all that kind of good stuff. So there's a couple of technical challenges there. And then I forget the last bit. There was 3 bits: Geo, Bluetooth, and...
there was a question around Google and Apple, or let's say the objection to their technology that they're introducing on tracing.
Yes, so I I don't know the decision making behind NHSX's view or decision to go with a centralized and not the Google side of things, but I would have imagined, you know, there's vendor lock-in considerations. There is how they treat and use data, and the transparency around kind of where data is stored, and you know, considerations you have with safe harbor and GDPR, et cetera, how that, if there's any secondary or tertiary use of that data. These are all kind of the considerations that anybody using those kind of platforms or anything within the public sector would be taking into account and consideration when they make procurement decisions and design decisions.
Thank you very much. We have a question probably to you, Neil. You talked about sort of like the importance of, you know, thinking, or maybe not now, like in a previous sort of discussions about the importance of cyber hygiene, the importance of, you know, paying attention to who we are corresponding with, etc. There's a question around how can two parties who have never transacted together on the internet be assured of each other's identity? So it's basically around identity theft. How can we trust the other person or the other party on the internet that we cannot see? And maybe a kind of an additional question to that: do you think that the awareness campaigns that, you know, the UN and other government agents, etc., have been introducing or have been implementing in the last few years have had an impact?
How do two parties on the internet who don't know each other confirm who each other is? I think we have to go a little bit old school on this and use the phone, probably is a nice way to start. And really it's running back to the basics. It's not sitting staring at the screen going, oh my goodness, is that a real person or not? Something that Lisa was saying struck with me, that just last week we got a call into our switchboard from a company who had received a letter from UNODC saying, we've frozen $4 million funding coming to you. Please make contact with us so that we can help to release it. Yeah, of course, we're going to do that. Clearly a fraud, or an attempt at a fraud. But for everyone that gets through and gets stopped and someone thinks about it, there will be those that do go through and people engage with. We know it happens day in, day out. So it comes back to that premise, I think, of if something feels too good to be true, then it probably isn't. And if you've got something from someone who you've never worked with before, then you need to put some measures in place. And if I look at how we, in my previous life, I used to work for the National Crime Agency, how we dealt with kidnap. Well, you're looking at proof of life. Is that hostage still alive? So before you start sending things back and forth and paying money, let's make sure that the person that we're engaging with is the person that we think we're engaging with. And that has to come offline at some point. And it might be on a phone with a signal or a WhatsApp call with a video proving that the screen I have in front of me is what you expect me to be seeing, and putting some other due diligence in. And this is where I think the whole crisis, we've been, many of us working at home or sitting at home, and we feel safe in our own houses, right? We feel most of us should. And the challenge with that is that we then take risks online that we wouldn't ordinarily do back home. And that it makes it harder for people like Dan to protect infrastructure when I can get onto whatever site I wish on my work laptop at home because it's not being filtered by the guys in the office. So there's those risks that emerge, and it brings us back to taking out specific threat areas and just sometimes taking a step back. Taking a moment to think before we push a button, before we engage with someone, and actually taking that moment to check our due diligence. There is nothing that is going to happen in those 2 minutes, 5 minutes, 10 minutes that it takes. And if you're feeling under pressure by another party online, then there is certainly a risk of chief executive officer or business email compromise fraud going on there. So we just need to take a minute to think about that. You had another question in there, but I've got the memory of a goldfish.
On the cyber hygiene and awareness, and how impactful do you think these are?
So yeah, it does work. And I'll give you an example which is slightly different to this specific topic that we've discussed. But in Central America, in El Salvador and Guatemala, where my staff run our global cyber programming from, we were dealing a lot with online child sexual abuse, which, as we all know, impacts on every country on earth. If there is an internet connection, a child will be being abused somewhere, quite often on corporate networks. It's not just at home. So the approach that we took in countries that weren't addressing this because they had no legislation, they had no policy, and government decision makers didn't have the necessary awareness of it, was that we got government on board. We made them understand what was going on, explained the risk and how they could put some measures in place. We build the criminal justice response by creating cyber investigative components within policing, within prosecutors, and within the judiciary. Critical to all of this is the prevention piece. So in both of these countries, which are economically developing, have some real societal challenges, we built permanent exhibitions on cybercrime in children's museums, because you get around 250,000 kids going through these museums every year. So they get to go in, they play with virtual reality headsets, they get to understand what is grooming, what is sextortion, what risks do you take online that may cause harm to you. And then from that, every occasion we do things like this, we have kids coming and self-reporting about being a victim of crime. And because we put the criminal justice bit in place, then that works. There are victims who are believed, and there are credible, highly expert investigators, prosecutors, and judges who can help. And I think that brings us back to the situation now of working from home, where we're currently working with 46,000 teachers in El Salvador, telling them and teaching them how to do a safe online Zoom lesson, how to put those basics in place to end a call if it all goes horribly wrong, how to put the basics of password protection and knowing who is coming onto your call in place.
Right. Thank you very much. And it seems to me that in the area of online child abuse, there's always some good success stories that can be told, which gives you hope for the other areas of cybercrime. A question to you, Lisa. There's a question around, do you think the trends in cybercrime are similar across the globe, or are there regional variations? And if so, are certain areas being targeted more than others?
Yeah, so I would say that the overall trend of kind of the use of disruption is certainly similar around the world, right? How that disruption is then being exploited, I think, differs by region. And the way that cyber criminals are very, very successful is that they take the news clips and they take what is happening within the country specifically, and they tailor that to attack and make their attacks very believable. So in the UK, we're seeing a lot of attacks based on CBILS, which is the Corona Business Interruption Loan Scheme. We're seeing a lot of attacks based on the reference to furloughed and figures like that. So from the economic crime perspective, they're actually taking regional and national and even local news and then using that in their attacks. But I think the overarching kind of use of the disruption as a mechanism by which they're going on the offensive is I would say common globally.
Right, and Neil talked a little bit about the kind of what they're doing on the child abuse front. What is it that you can hail as a success story that actually emerged from this private sector input into this one?
So it's a success story, and I deal more on the public sector than on the private sector. But with respect to cyber and economic crime in particular, what we've seen is real action from the FIUs and the financial sector supervisors to raise awareness. And so the EBA came out quite quickly with guidance on COVID-related disruptions that they were seeing, and how they were expecting the national competent authorities to enact new guidance on AML CFT supervision as a result of the COVID disruptions. FATF came out last week with additional guidance on their own for COVID-related disruptions and how they were expecting the regulators and therefore the private sector entities to enact enhanced supervision techniques to identify and disrupt some of this activity and to combat against the criminal activity that we're seeing. I think the private sector side as well has been incredibly proactive in terms of identifying areas for disruption. They've been proactively communicating with their customers to say, these are the types of attacks that we are seeing. We will never, the UK Finance here in the UK has a great campaign that raises awareness around what information your financial institution would ask for from you. So for example, your financial institution will never send you a text message asking you to send them back any financial information of your own. So it's just reminding people of those very basics and those hygiene factors in this time of disruption, because there's a real human element to this where people, as I said before, are feeling scared and vulnerable. And when you're scared and vulnerable and somebody looks legitimate to you, you are more likely to be trusting of them because you want to feel safe. And so I think the private sector financial institutions are doing a good job here trying to just raise awareness of what safety actually is, as opposed to the illusion of safety that cyber criminals can create.
And I guess you're right in the sense that financial institutions have always been on the forefront of cybersecurity efforts just because of the nature of their work and because crime follows money. We see a lot of good practices that have been or that started with financial institutions. Another question probably to you, Dan, but also Anil and Lisa are welcome to comment on. What do you think are the future vulnerabilities, cyber vulnerabilities that we can predict and that the UK should be preparing for?
So I'd probably qualify that slightly by saying future cyber risks, because the vulnerability is unknown at the moment. But so future cyber generated by COVID. So one of the things that I would say is in a post-COVID world, the rate of digital health and clinical kind of capabilities and technologies will remain. We've delivered at a phenomenal rate, additional capability capacity, and the system has responded particularly well. So this is from remote working through to increased use of electronic prescriptions, et cetera, et cetera. The risks that they will pose is greater data sharing, ultimately having central kind of records with more data on it. So each one of those becomes more valuable to a nefarious actor. So that is an area that is an area of cyber risk that will need to be addressed. The ensuring that you have the infrastructure in place to be able to deal with a huge workforce working remotely is going to be another area that we will need to be addressed. And it's always been in our plans, because I say the long-term plan for the NHS is greater focus on community working as we move more from cure and into prevention, and that prevention means community-based clinical care, etc. So that is something I mentioned earlier, shifting left, that all those plans, etc., activities will need to move to the left. And then in terms of other vulnerabilities, I think what COVID will have also done is really kind of put another stark light on legacy bits of tin and infrastructure. So we'd sorted out, kind of effectively sorted out the OS operating systems, but there is old bits of actual tin. So when we move towards a cloud-based, I think it will increase the cloud-first initiatives, internet-first initiatives. There will be the local infrastructure needs to be able to support that. So but that errs into more of the IT operations, IT hygiene element, rather than a cyber risk per se. The ignoring of the IT hygiene leads to a cyber risk. I think we have an opportunity to be able to kind of update, kind of bring into the 21st century local infrastructures, obviously affordability aside, before they become a cyber risk. So I think there's an opportunity here to stem the emergence of meaningful, significant systemic cyber risk.
Thank you very much. Neil, maybe we hear from you, what do you think the vulnerabilities that we should be, or risks that we should be preparing for, and any final comments that you might have for us, important key messages in a couple of minutes?
Sure. I think we need to be aware of the sadly rather distasteful element, which is there are some governments or advanced persistent threat actors aligned with governments who have taken the opportunity to exploit the pandemic. And we saw this with WannaCry, we saw it with NotPetya, we see it with any broad areas that impact us across the board. And the work that we're doing in the UN to try and do cyber diplomacy and minimize some of these risks, it is immensely irritating when we see things like this happening. Just this morning, we saw a vulnerability in a multi-factor authentication capability on iOS, or on macOS. And these sorts of challenges, and the message that we keep giving to government is just because you have the capability to do something doesn't necessarily mean that you should, especially in an epidemic or a pandemic like this that impacts on every country around the world. Why someone is sitting back in government, in whatever agency that may be, and making a decision, let's try and weaponize this, let's try and harm this, let's try and put malware into antivirus or COVID virus apps is just utterly inhumane. So I think this is where we have to step back, look at the risks that have come out, that we've seen, and then try and predict how these would be used in the future and put a lot more effort into countering these.
Thank you very much. And that also puts in and highlight the importance of the global conversations on cyber governance and how states should actually act with each other in cyberspace, what they should respect and not do in order to get to a responsible state behavior. Lisa, any final comments from you? What do you think we should be thinking about, and any concluding remarks?
I think we've covered the majority of the things that we should be thinking about. But in terms of a final remark, I would say that as we look forward to the disruption, we should think about the changes that it has caused in our lives already. What of those do we want to maintain, particularly from enhanced security perspectives, to go forward so that we are more resilient? It is very likely that there will be a second, if not third, resurgence of the virus and formal lockdowns again. We need to be prepared for that now. We have the time now to invest and to make sure that this doesn't happen in such a disruptive way at the next time around.
Right. Thank you very much. Unfortunately, we've reached the end of our time today. This has been really a fascinating conversation, and your perspectives have really enriched the conversation. I wish we had more time. Maybe we'll do a second round soon. Obviously, the risk is far from being over. We have to keep thinking about these issues as a matter of priority, and each one of us has a very important role to play, and cyber hygiene and cybersecurity should always be at the forefront of our thinking and not an afterthought. Thank you very much for Neil, for Dan, for Lisa for joining us today. Thank you for all the members who've joined us online. Please stay safe, cyber safe as well, and we will speak to you again soon. Thank you. Have a good day.